In the sleepy, unassuming town of Maple Hollow, life had always been simple. The houses lined the quiet streets like well-kept secrets, and the people knew each other's names and stories. There was a sense of familiarity, comfort, and trust among the residents, until the day Margaret Langley saw something that changed everything. It was a cool autumn afternoon when Margaret, a local librarian in her mid-30s, was walking home from work. The streets were quieter than usual, and a heavy fog had begun to settle in, turning the ordinary into the eerie. As she passed by the corner of Elm Street and Sycamore Avenue, she noticed a silver sedan parked on the side of the road. The window was rolled down, and inside a man in a dark suit was arguing with a woman, one Margaret recognized as Sarah Miller, the town's beloved kindergarten teacher. At first, Margaret thought it was just a heated but ordinary conversation, but then she saw the man's hand shoot out, grabbing Sarah by the wrist with an aggressive force that made Margaret stop in her tracks. The woman's face twisted in pain, her eyes wide with fear. Margaret's heart raced. She wasn't sure if she should intervene or just mind her own business, but instinctively she grabbed her phone and snapped a quick picture of the scene. Then she quietly backed away, trying to distance herself without drawing attention to herself. She didn't know why she felt so compelled to keep watching, but something about the situation didn't sit right. The man shoved Sarah into the car, and with a screech of tires, the sedan sped off. Margaret stood frozen for a few moments, her phone still in hand. She stared at the picture she had taken, the blurry image of the man's angry face and Sarah's pleading eyes. Margaret's first instinct was to go to the police, but she hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if she was overreacting? But as she walked back to her house, the image of Sarah's terror gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something horrible had just happened. That evening, she made the decision. Margaret called the Maple Hollow Police Department and spoke to Officer Adam Miller, a neighbor and family friend. She told him about what she had seen, the argument, the violence, and the car speeding off. She even sent him the picture. "Thanks for calling, Margaret. This is serious," Officer Miller said, his voice calm but with an undertone of concern. "We'll investigate it immediately. You did the right thing." The next few hours passed in a blur of anxiety and fear. Margaret tried to reassure herself, but the image of Sarah's face stayed with her. The feeling of helplessness lingered. It wasn't until around midnight when things took an unexpected turn. She was woken by the sound of her doorbell ringing, followed by a sharp knock. It was odd. Margaret wasn't expecting anyone. She quickly threw on her robe and opened the door to find Officer Miller standing there, his face pale, eyes wide with disbelief. "Margaret," he said, almost too quietly, "Sarah Miller is gone. She's vanished. There's no trace of her anywhere." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "What do you mean? I told you about what I saw. I have the picture. I know," Officer Miller interrupted, holding up a piece of paper. It was a printout of her own photo. But when he turned it toward her, her stomach dropped. The man in the photo was no longer the stranger she remembered. It was someone she recognized. It was Adam Miller himself. "Wow, what?" Margaret stammered, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. "Margaret," Officer Miller continued, his voice shaking, "the problem is no one in town has ever seen this man before, and Sarah, well, she's not missing. She's gone. Completely. No one knows where she is, and there are no clues at all." Margaret's world started to spin. She backed away, trying to make sense of it. "But why would you? What's going on? I don't understand." "I think you've been mistaken," Officer Miller said, his face turning cold. "There's no need to get involved any further. The town's a small place, and people have been known to get things wrong. Just forget what you saw, Margaret." Margaret froze. The tone in his voice, the way his eyes suddenly seemed darker, colder. Something was terribly wrong. What? No, Margaret felt the urge to speak, to argue, but her words caught in her throat. The officer took a step forward, and Margaret instinctively stepped back, her mind racing with confusion and terror. "Trust me, Margaret," Officer Miller said softly. "There's nothing more you need to know." Before she could react, he reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip was firm, unnaturally strong. Margaret tried to pull away, but it felt like he was growing more powerful by the second, his hand tightening around her wrist. "I'll make sure this all goes away for you, Margaret," he murmured, his smile unsettlingly thin. "But you have to let it go."
Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the nightmare she had stumbled into. This wasn't about Sarah anymore. It was about her. She had become a witness to something much darker than she could have imagined. "Don't come near me!" she shouted, finally managing to break free from his grasp. The force of her movement sent her crashing to the floor, but she quickly scrambled to her feet and bolted toward the door. Before she could reach the handle, the lights flickered and went out. The house was plunged into darkness. Margaret's pulse raced as she fumbled for her phone, but it slipped from her hands, crashing to the floor. The air was thick with an unnatural silence. She could feel him standing just behind her. Then, a voice, cold and unrecognizable, whispered through the shadows. "It's already too late, Margaret." In a panic, Margaret turned to the door, but it was gone. The walls around her seemed to close in. She backed away, feeling trapped, her breath shallow. But as she reached the corner of the room, something caught her eye. A mirror, placed on the wall in a way she hadn't noticed before. The reflection in the mirror wasn't hers. It was Sarah Miller, standing with a vacant, hollow expression, her eyes hollow and lifeless. The reflection didn't move. It just stared, silent and still. The door suddenly swung open with a terrifying force, and Margaret was thrown back, tumbling into the black void of the hallway. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the overwhelming darkness. And in the silence, she knew. The town of Maple Hollow was hiding something far more sinister than anyone could have ever imagined. The next morning, there was no trace of Margaret Langley. Her home was untouched, with the front door slightly ajar. The police searched for days, but they couldn't find a single clue. Margaret's disappearance became another mysterious case, lost to the shadows of the town. But in the deepest corners of Maple Hollow, those who knew the truth understood. Margaret was no longer just a witness. She had become part of the dark history that no one dared speak of, and the clock was ticking for anyone who got too close to the truth. Hey there, awesome viewer! If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share with your friends. Your support helps the channel grow and keeps the content coming.